I found a fortune that could save my dying daughter, but the gold was cursed, soaked in the blood of 37 souls murdered 20 years ago. And when I spent it, the dead came looking for payment. Some debts, I learned too late, can only be paid with everything you have left. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The prospector's shovel rang against something that wasn't supposed to be there. Metal. Cold. Buried 6 feet down in earth that had been keeping its secrets since before Arizona had a name. Marcus Kane dropped to his knees in the shallow grave he'd been digging for 3 days straight, brushing dirt away with fingers that shook, not from exhaustion, though God knows he was bone-tired, but from something that tasted like destiny mixed with dread. It was a strongbox, iron-bound, locked tight, and heavy as a man's soul when he's carrying guilt. The morning sun cast long shadows across Devil's Canyon, and for a moment Marcus wondered if the shadow falling across his face was his own or something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in this godforsaken place for him to arrive with his hunger and his desperation. He'd come here chasing rumors. Whispers in Tucson saloons about Confederate gold lost in the war's dying days. A wagon train that vanished between Fort Huachuca and nowhere, leaving behind nothing but wheel ruts and the kind of stories men tell when they're too drunk to lie properly. Most prospectors would have dismissed it as whiskey talk, but Marcus wasn't most prospectors. He was a man with debts that breathed down his neck and a daughter back in St. Louis who needed medicine that cost more than hope. The lock was old, corroded, but still solid. Marcus had tools. A man learns to carry what he needs when he's betting his life on holes in the ground. The prying took 20 minutes and 2 broken iron bars, but when that lid finally cracked open, the sight inside made him forget how to breathe properly. Gold. More gold than he'd seen in 15 years of scratching at the earth's bones. Coins stamped with eagles and dates from before the war. Ingots that gleamed like captured sunlight. Enough wealth to buy his daughter's cure 10 times over. To set himself up in a real town with real opportunities. To never again wake up wondering if today was the day the desert finally claimed him. But underneath the gold, wrapped in oilcloth that still held its shape after all these years, was something else. Papers, military dispatches, and a diary bound in leather, so fine it must have cost more than most men made in a year. Marcus opened it with hands that suddenly felt too clumsy for the task, and the first page made his blood run cold. Property of Colonel Thomas Whitmore, Confederate States Army. May the Lord forgive us for what we did to get this gold, and may he damn us if we try to profit from it. The entries that followed painted a picture Marcus wished he'd never seen. A wagon train, yes, but not a military convoy. Civilians. Families fleeing the war's destruction, carrying everything they owned, trusting in soldiers who'd sworn to protect them. And those soldiers, Whitmore's men, had murdered them all. Every last soul, from white-haired grandfathers to babies still learning their first words, butchered them like cattle and claimed their goods as spoils of war. Marcus slammed the diary shut, but the words were already burned into his mind. This wasn't treasure. This was blood money. The weight of 37 souls pressed down on him like the desert sun at high noon, and for the first time in his life, he understood why some men went mad in the wilderness. He could walk away, leave the box buried, forget this place existed, go back to his small, honest claims that yielded just enough to keep body and soul together. But his daughter's face swam before his eyes, pale, growing thinner each day, while doctors in St. Louis spoke of treatments that might save her life, if only he could find the money. The desert wind kicked up, swirling dust around the excavation site, and for a moment Marcus could swear he heard voices, whispers, the sound of a baby crying somewhere in the distance. But when he looked up, there was nothing but empty sky and the buzzards circling high overhead, waiting for something to die. Marcus Kane closed the strongbox, hoisted it up from its grave, and loaded it into his wagon with hands that no longer felt like his own. As he drove away from Devil's Canyon, he told himself he was saving his daughter's life. He didn't let himself think about the 37 ghosts who might be following him home, hungry for the justice they'd been denied all these years. Behind him, the desert wind covered his tracks, but some trails can never be erased. Some debts follow a man no matter how far he runs. St. Louis welcomed Marcus Kane like a whore welcomes a preacher, with open arms and hidden knives. He'd sold the gold through channels that didn't ask questions, men who dealt in discretion the way other men dealt in flour and nails. The transactions took 3 weeks, conducted in back rooms that smelled of cigars and secrets, with handshakes that felt like contracts written in disappearing ink. When it was done, Marcus found himself holding more money than he'd ever imagined owning, enough to buy his daughter's cure and still live like a king for the rest of his days. Sarah Kane had been wasting away in a boarding house room that overlooked the muddy Mississippi, cared for by a widow named Mrs. Henderson, who charged by the day and measured out kindness like she was rationing sugar in wartime. When Marcus walked through that door with a doctor and a carpetbag full of hope, his daughter's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Papa," she whispered, her voice barely stronger than autumn leaves scraping against window glass. "I knew you'd come back." Dr. Morrison was one of those men who wore competence like a well-tailored coat, expensive, but worth every penny. He examined Sarah with hands that had saved more lives than they'd lost, prescribed treatments that sounded like miracles spoken in Latin, and promised that with proper care and the right medicines, she could be running through fields by next spring. The money flowed like water from a broken dam. Medicines shipped from Boston and Baltimore. A private room in the city's finest boarding house, with windows that caught the morning sun and walls thick enough to keep out the world's noise. Clothes that fit properly. Food that nourished instead of merely filling empty space. And books, dear God. So many books, because Sarah had inherited her father's hunger for stories, even if she'd also inherited her mother's weak lungs. For 3 months, Marcus Kane lived like a man who'd found absolution at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. He watched his daughter grow stronger every day, color returning to her cheeks like sunrise creeping across the prairie. They took walks along the riverfront, short ones at first, then longer as her strength returned. She laughed again, a sound Marcus had almost forgotten, sweet as church bells on Sunday morning. But late at night, when Sarah slept peacefully in her comfortable bed and the city settled into its uneasy quiet, Marcus would lie awake listening to sounds that weren't there, whispers in the walls, the cry of a baby that might have been the wind, footsteps in the hallway outside their door that stopped just short of knocking. He told himself it was guilt, a conscience finally waking up after years of being ignored. Rich men felt guilty about their money. That was natural, normal, the price of climbing from poverty to prosperity in a single leap. But the whispers kept getting louder, and sometimes, in the mirror, he caught glimpses of faces that weren't his own. The first death happened on a Tuesday. Mrs. Henderson was found at the bottom of her boarding house stairs, neck twisted at an angle that spoke of sudden stops and gravity's revenge. The police called it an accident. Old woman, worn steps. Tragic, but common enough in a city where tragedy was as regular as the morning paper. But Marcus had seen the woman climb those stairs 100 times, sure-footed as a mountain goat, despite her age. The second death was Dr. Morrison. Heart attack, they said, though he was barely 50 and healthy as a horse. Found slumped over his desk in his office, one hand still reaching for his medical bag, as if he'd been trying to treat himself for something that had no earthly cure. Marcus began carrying a gun, a Colt revolver that felt heavier each day, loaded with bullets he prayed he'd never have to use, but somehow knew he would. He hired guards, big men with scarred knuckles and eyes that had seen too much violence to be surprised by more. But guards couldn't protect against the kind of enemy that walked through walls and whispered secrets to sleeping children. Sarah noticed the change. "Papa, you look tired," she said one morning, her small hand resting on his arm with concern that cut deeper than any knife. "Are you sleeping?" How could he tell her that sleep had become a battlefield, that every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces, men, women, children, all of them bearing wounds that bled gold instead of blood. How could he explain that the money saving her life was payment for 37 murders, and that the dead had finally learned where to send their bill? "I'm fine, sweetheart." He lied, because fathers lie to protect their children, even when the truth might be the only thing that could save them both. "Just working too hard. Maybe we should take a trip somewhere nice. Somewhere quiet." But there was nowhere quiet enough to escape the sound of voices that grew louder each night, demanding justice that no earthly court could provide. The answer came in a letter delivered by a boy who disappeared before Marcus could ask his name. The envelope was expensive paper, cream-colored and watermarked, but the writing inside was done in red ink that looked too much like dried blood. "Mr. Kane." It read in a spidery hand that seemed to crawl across the page. "We know what you found. We know what you've done with it. The gold was ours before it was theirs, earned through honest work and honest lives. You have 7 days to return what was taken, 7 days to make things right, or your daughter will join us in learning what justice looks like when the dead get tired of waiting." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Marcus knew who'd sent it, even if those who'd sent it had been in the ground for 20 years. The 7th day dawned gray as gunpowder, with clouds that pressed down on St. Louis like a judge's gavel waiting to fall. Marcus Kane sat in his daughter's room, watching her sleep, memorizing the curve of her cheek and the way her eyelashes cast shadows on skin that was finally, blessedly, the color of life instead of death. The medicine had worked its miracle. Sarah would live, would grow up, would have the chance to love and lose and hope and dream like any other girl her age. All it had cost was 37 souls and his own peace of mind. The money was gone, every last dollar spent on cures and comfort. Even if he wanted to return the gold, and God help him, part of him did, there was nothing left to return. The choice had been made weeks ago, coin by coin, dose by dose, in a boarding house room that smelled of carbolic acid and desperate hope. Sarah stirred, opened eyes that were her mother's shade of blue, and smiled at him with trust so complete it felt like a physical weight on his chest. "Good morning, Papa. Are we going to take that trip today?" "Maybe," he said, voice rougher than he'd intended. "Would you like that?" "Only if you want to. I like it here. Mrs. Henderson makes the best biscuits, and Dr. Morrison says I'm getting so strong I'll be able to run races soon." She paused, studying his face with the intensity only children could muster. "But you still look tired. Maybe a trip would help you sleep better." If only it were that simple. If only sleep were the enemy instead of the 47 ghosts who'd learned his name and address, who whispered in his dreams about justice and payment and the price of stealing from the dead. The knock came at noon, soft and polite, like death asking permission to enter. Marcus opened the door expecting to find his worst fears given flesh, but instead found a woman. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in traveling clothes that had seen better days, but still maintained their dignity. Her hair was steel gray, pulled back severe, and her eyes held the kind of sadness that comes from burying everyone you've ever loved. "Mr. Kane?" Her voice was soft, educated, with the faint trace of a Virginia accent that had been worn smooth by years of exile. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I believe you found something that belonged to my late husband." The name hit him like a physical blow. Whitmore, Colonel Thomas Whitmore, whose diary sat hidden in Marcus's trunk like a loaded gun, waiting for the wrong hand to find it. "I don't know what you mean," Marcus said, but his voice carried the weight of lies, and they both heard it. Mrs. Whitmore smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "May I come in? I believe we have much to discuss, and some conversations are better held in private." Sarah was napping, the afternoon rest that Dr. Morrison had prescribed to help her body finish its healing. Marcus led Mrs. Whitmore to the small sitting room, offered her tea she declined, and waited for her to speak the words that would either damn him or save him. 20 years ago, she began, settling her skirts with the precise movements of a woman accustomed to maintaining composure under pressure. "My husband led a Confederate unit through Arizona territory. They were supposed to be escorting civilian refugees to safety, but instead..." She paused, swallowed something that might have been shame or grief or both. Instead, they murdered those innocent people and took their possessions. 37 souls, Mr. Kane. Men, women, children. All dead because my husband chose greed over honor. Marcus said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only honest response. Thomas came home from the war a broken man. The gold was hidden away, never touched, never sold. He said it was cursed, that the dead followed him wherever he went. I thought it was Gil talking, the way Gil talks to men who've done terrible things. But after he died, she looked up, met Marcus's eyes directly. After he died, I learned better. What do you want from me? The same thing they want from you. Justice, restitution, an end to the haunting that's followed my family for 2 decades. She reached into her traveling bag, withdrew a leather portfolio that matched the diary Marcus had hidden away. I have the names, Mr. Kane. All 37 of them. Families who trusted Confederate soldiers to protect them and died for their trust. Their descendants deserve compensation for what was stolen. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The money's gone. Every penny. I spent it on your daughter's medicine. Yes, I know. Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened slightly. I've been watching you, Mr. Kane, learning about your situation. The child was dying, and you found a way to save her. I won't pretend I don't understand the choice you made. Then what? I'm offering you a partnership, a way to make things right without destroying the good that's already been done. She opened the portfolio, revealing papers covered in neat handwriting, maps marked with careful annotations, and photographs of faces both young and old. I've spent 20 years tracking down the descendants of those murdered families. Some are prosperous now, some are struggling, but all of them have a legal claim to what was stolen from their ancestors. Marcus studied the documents, recognizing the weight of what she was proposing. You want me to help you find more of the gold? I want us to find all of it. Thomas buried several caches before he died, scattered across Arizona and New Mexico. Maps hidden in books, clues embedded in letters. A treasure hunt designed by a madman's guilt. But together, with what you've learned and what I know, we can locate every cache, liquidate everything, and distribute the proceeds to the rightful heirs. And if I refuse? Mrs. Whitmore's smile was sad but final. Then the ghosts will continue their work. They've already started, haven't they? People around you dying in ways that look like accidents but feel like judgment? It will only get worse, Mr. Kane. They won't stop until they have justice, one way or another. Through the thin walls, Marcus could hear Sarah stirring, beginning to wake from her nap. Soon she'd call for him, wanting to show him another page she'd read or another picture she'd drawn. The future stretched before them both, bright with possibility if he could just find the courage to embrace it without looking over his shoulder for the vengeful dead. How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know this isn't just another kind of trap? Mrs. Whitmore reached into her bag once more, withdrew something that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a daguerreotype, old and faded, but clear enough to show the faces of a family. Parents and 3 children, posed in their Sunday best with expressions of hope and dignity. Across the bottom, someone had written in faded ink, "The Morrison family, bound for California, 1863. Dr. Morrison, the same name as the doctor who treated Sarah, who died of an impossible heart attack at 50 years old. The dead remember names, Mr. Kane. They remember faces, and they're very, very patient." Mrs. Whitmore tucked the photograph away. But they can also be merciful, if justice is served willingly rather than extracted by force. From the bedroom came Sarah's voice, soft and happy, calling for her father. Marcus Kane closed his eyes, made his choice, and stepped onto a path that would either lead to redemption or destruction. He just hoped he'd be alive to see which one it turned out to be. The Arizona sun was a hammer, and the earth was its anvil, and Marcus Kane felt like metal being shaped between them into something he didn't recognize. He'd left Sarah in the care of a church-sponsored boarding house run by nuns who asked no questions and accepted payment. in the form of anonymous donations that appeared in their donation box like miracles. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about this situation was perfect, but it was safe. The sisters knew how to protect children from the world's cruelties, and more importantly, they knew how to pray, which Marcus suspected would be more useful than bullets against the enemies following him. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore rode beside him through the desert landscape, her presence as steady and inevitable as the sunrise. She traded her city clothes for practical riding gear that looked like it had seen its share of rough country, and she handled her horse with the confidence of someone who'd learned to depend on herself in a world that hadn't been particularly kind to women with steel in their spines. "The first cache is 3 days' ride from here," she said, consulting a map that looked like it had been drawn by a man in the grip of fever dreams. Thomas marked it with symbols that corresponded to passages in his Bible, the one he read from every night after the nightmares got bad enough to wake the whole house. Marcus adjusted his hat against the sun's relentless assault and tried not to think about the parallels between his situation and that of a man who'd spent 20 years being haunted by his choices. "How many caches are there?" "5, scattered across 2 territories. Maybe 6. Some of his letters suggest he buried something near Santa Fe, but the clues are cryptic." She folded the map carefully, tucked it into her saddlebag with the reverence of someone handling a holy relic. Each one represents a different stage of his guilt. The first was buried in rage, the second in fear, the third in desperation. By the time he buried the last one, near the place where the murders happened, he was barely coherent. The landscape around them looked like God had started to create something beautiful, and then lost interest halfway through. Red rocks thrust up from soil the color of dried blood, and the only vegetation consisted of plants armed with thorns, as if the desert had learned to defend itself against anything foolish enough to try to live there. "Tell me about the families," Marcus said, because the silence was beginning to feel heavier than the heat. Mrs. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where heat waves made everything shimmer like a mirage. "The Morrisons, the ones in the photograph I showed you, were farmers from Ohio. They'd lost their homestead to the war and were heading west to start over. John Morrison was a veterinarian, Martha was a teacher, and their 3 children were. God, they were so young. The youngest was barely walking." Her voice caught slightly, and Marcus realized this wasn't just about justice for her. This was personal. The Hartleys were merchants from Atlanta, carrying what was left of their inventory and their life savings. The Kowalski family had fled religious persecution in Illinois. The Davis clan was led by a preacher who'd lost his church to Sherman's army. All of them looking for a fresh start. All of them trusting Confederate soldiers to see them safely through hostile territory. And your husband's men killed them all. Every last soul. 37 people murdered for their possessions. Their bodies left for the buzzards and the desert wind. Mrs. Whitmore's hands tightened on her reins, knuckles white against the leather. Thomas came home with their blood on his conscience and their gold in his pockets, and he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out which was heavier. They rode in silence after that, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through rocks that looked like monuments to some forgotten catastrophe. Marcus found himself listening for other sounds, voices, footsteps, cry of a baby, but the desert kept its own counsel. The first cache was buried beneath a stand of cottonwood trees that shouldn't have existed in that barren landscape, as if the earth itself was marking the spot where guilt had been interred. Marcus and Mrs. Whitmore dug for 2 hours in the shade that felt like salvation, their shovels ringing against stone and root and finally, inevitably metal. This strongbox was smaller than the one Marcus had found, but no less heavy. Inside was more gold, more Confederate currency that was worthless now, and another journal wrapped in oilcloth. Mrs. Whitmore opened it with hands that trembled slightly, revealing pages covered in her late husband's increasingly erratic handwriting. "May 15th, 1864, she read aloud. "The dreams are getting worse. Last night I saw little Mary Morrison standing at the foot of my bed, asking why I let them hurt her mama. I tried to explain about orders and necessity, but you can't explain murder to a 6-year-old, even a dead one. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the desert evening. Mrs. Whitmore. June 3rd, 1864. Eleanor thinks I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. But how do you tell your wife that the dead don't stay buried when they've been wronged? How do you explain that I hear their voices every night, calling for justice that no earthly court can provide? She closed the journal, wrapped it back in its protective covering, and placed it gently in the strongbox with the reverence of someone handling the bones of saints. He was a good man once, before the war took that away from him. I have to believe that, because otherwise, what does that make me for loving him? They loaded the cash onto their pack horse and rode on, 2 people carrying the weight of other people's sins through a landscape that looked like the aftermath of God's wrath. Behind them, the cottonwood trees swayed in a wind that sounded almost like whispering, almost like voices calling from a great distance. As the sun set, painting the sky the color of fresh blood, Marcus realized that finding the gold was only the beginning. The real challenge would be living long enough to distribute it to people who deserved it, while avoiding the justice that 37 ghosts had been patiently planning for 20 years. In his saddlebags, wrapped in a spare shirt, the original diary from Devil's Canyon seemed to pulse with its own malevolent heartbeat. Some burdens got heavier the farther you carried them, and Marcus was beginning to understand why Colonel Whitmore had spent his final years digging holes in the desert and filling them with guilt made manifest in gold and silver. The desert wind kicked up as they made camp, swirling dust and debris around their small fire, and for just a moment Marcus could swear he saw faces in the smoke, men, women, children, all of them watching with eyes that reflected flames like judgment. Tomorrow they would dig up the second cache, and the third, and however many more it took to empty the desert of its buried secrets. But tonight, as he lay in his bedroll listening to sounds that might have been wind or might have been voices, Marcus Kane wondered if he was racing toward redemption or simply digging his own grave one shovelful at a time. By the time they reached the 4th cache, the desert had begun to feel like a living thing, something vast and patient and hungry, watching their every move with the cold calculation of a predator deciding when to strike. Marcus Kane had grown thin from the constant travel and poor sleep, his face weathered by sun and wind until it looked like leather left too long in the elements. His hands shook when he thought no one was looking, and sometimes he caught himself talking to people who weren't there, answering questions whispered by voices that came from empty air. Mrs. Whitmore, by contrast, seemed to grow stronger with each cache they unearthed, as if redistributing her husband's cursed gold was feeding something essential in her soul. She'd begun reciting the names of the dead each morning like a prayer. John Morrison, Martha Morrison, little Mary Morrison. All 37 of them called forth from whatever place the murdered went to wait for justice. The 4th cache was different from the others. Bigger, hidden not in some random spot marked by guilt and geography, but in the ruins of an old Spanish mission that predated the war by a century. The walls were crumbling adobe, the roof long since collapsed, but something about the place felt consecrated, protected by older laws than anything written by men with guns and grievances. "He buried this one last," Mrs. Whitmore said, consulting her husband's journals as they stood in the mission's central courtyard. After the nightmares got so bad, he couldn't sleep anymore. After the doctors said his heart was giving out from the strain of carrying all that guilt. They dug in the shadow of what had once been an altar, their shovels scraping against stone worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' prayers. The strongbox they finally unearthed was massive, big enough to hold a man, though Marcus tried not to think about what else might have been buried here over the years. Inside was more gold than they'd found in all the previous caches combined, but also something else. A stack of letters tied with ribbon, each one addressed in the same spidery handwriting they'd grown to know too well. Mrs. Whitmore untied the ribbon with fingers that barely trembled, unfolded the first letter, and began to read aloud in the fading afternoon light. "My dearest Eleanor," she read, her voice catching slightly on her own name. "If you are reading this, then you have found the final cache, and you have chosen to complete the work I was too cowardly to finish myself. The gold in this box represents the last of what we stole from those innocent families, their life savings, their hope for a future, their children's inheritance, all of it bought with blood and paid for with 20 years of nightmares. Marcus sat heavily on a broken stone that might once have been part of a pew, listening to a dead man's confession echo through the ruins of a place where a better man had once sought forgiveness. I have tried, Mrs. Whitmore continued, to find the descendants of our victims, to make restitution, to somehow balance the scales of justice that my cowardice tipped so far toward damnation. But every attempt has been met with resistance. The dead have become impatient, Eleanor. They want their justice, and they want it delivered by hands that aren't stained with the blood of their murders. The wind picked up as the sun began to set, swirling dust through the mission ruins and making sounds that could have been atmospheric or could have been voices. It was getting harder to tell the difference. Marcus found himself looking over his shoulder more and more, expecting to see faces that shouldn't be there, bodies that cast shadows without blocking any light. The names and addresses of the family's descendants are in the other documents buried with this letter. Use the gold to make their lives better, to give them opportunities their ancestors never had, to show them that sometimes justice comes late, but comes nonetheless. And tell them that Thomas Whitmore spent every day of his remaining life trying to figure out how to undo what couldn't be undone. Mrs. Whitmore folded the letter carefully, but not before Marcus caught sight of the final lines, written in a hand so shaky it was barely legible. I pray that when you finish this work, the voices will finally stop. I pray that the dead will find their rest, and that the living will find their peace. But mostly, I pray that you will forgive me for leaving you to clean up the mess I was too weak to handle myself. The silence that followed was broken by a sound neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Footsteps, dozens of them, circling the mission ruins like wolves who'd finally decided their prey was cornered. Marcus reached for his gun, but Mrs. Whitmore placed a restraining hand on his arm. "They're not here to hurt us," she said quietly, though her voice carried less confidence than her words. "They're here to witness." Witness what? The end of it, the completion of the circle, justice delivered after 20 years of waiting. She stood, brushing dust from her riding skirt, and walked to the center of the courtyard. "We know you're here," she called to the empty air, her voice echoing off the broken walls. "We know what you want, and we're ready to give it to you." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. The wind stilled completely, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. And then, one by one, they appeared. Not as solid figures. Marcus's eyes weren't quite that far gone yet, but as impressions, shadows, half-glimpsed movements that resolved into the shapes of people when he wasn't looking directly at them. Men in work clothes, women in traveling dresses, children who should have grown up to have children of their own, all of them bearing the wounds that had sent them to whatever place the murdered went to wait for justice. Mrs. Whitmore knelt beside the open strongbox, began lifting out handfuls of gold coins that caught the last light of the setting sun. "John Morrison," she called, and one of the shadows stepped forward. "This is for you and yours, for Martha and the children, for the farm you never got to build, for the grandchildren who never got to be born." She set aside a portion of the gold, and the shadow of John Morrison nodded once before fading back into the gathering dusk. One by one, she called the names. One by one, she divided the gold. One by one, the shadows stepped forward to claim what had been stolen from them, acknowledgement of their deaths and their worth, and their right to be remembered by the living. When the last name had been called and the last portion set aside, Mrs. Whitmore stood in the center of a mission courtyard that suddenly felt empty in a way it hadn't for 20 years. The ghosts were gone, their vigil ended, their justice finally served. Marcus Kane gathered up a share of the responsibility. The gold he would carry to living descendants, the letters he would deliver from a dead man seeking forgiveness he'd never lived to receive. It felt heavier than it should have, but also lighter somehow, as if the weight of the cursed metal had been balanced by the weight of purpose. "Is it over?" he asked as they loaded the gold onto their pack animals. Mrs. Whitmore looked around the mission ruins, listening for voices that were no longer there, watching for shadows that had finally found their rest. For them, yes. For us, she smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had known her, it reached her eyes. For us, it's just beginning. They rode away from the mission as the last light faded from the western sky, carrying gold that was no longer cursed and the names of people who deserved to know that their ancestors had been remembered, had been mourned, had been avenged by the desert wind and the patience of the dead. Behind them, the ruins settled into the peace they'd been seeking for 20 years, and the desert wind carried no voices at all. 6 months later, Marcus Kane stood on the front porch of a farmhouse outside Denver, holding a leather portfolio that contained more than money. It contained stories, apologies, and the weight of justice finally served. The woman who answered his knock was perhaps 30 years old, with calloused hands and eyes that knew the cost of working land that didn't always cooperate. Behind her, 2 children peered around her skirts, curious about the stranger who'd ridden up their dusty drive with the deliberate manner of someone carrying important news. "Mrs. Patricia Morrison Hayes?" Marcus asked, removing his hat out of respect for the conversation he was about to have. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" Marcus opened the portfolio, withdrew a daguerreotype that showed a family posed in their Sunday best, parents and 3 children, all of them wearing expressions of hope and dignity. "I believe these people were your great-grandparents, John and Martha Morrison and their children." The woman's hand went to her throat, recognizing faces she'd seen only in faded family stories, relatives who'd disappeared into the Western Territories and never been heard from again. Where did you get this?" "It's a long story, Mrs. Hayes. Do you have time to hear it?" Over the next hour, Marcus told her everything. About the Confederate soldiers who'd murdered her ancestors for their possessions, about the gold that had been hidden away for 20 years, about the ghosts who'd finally gotten their justice, and the living descendants who deserved to know their family's fate. When he finished, Mrs. Hayes sat in silence for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of the daguerreotype with the reverence of someone touching holy relics. "They never made it to California," she said finally. "We always wondered what happened to them. Mama used to tell stories about great-grandfather John's veterinary practice, about how he could heal any animal but couldn't fix a broken heart." Marcus reached into his portfolio, withdrew a bank draft that represented a fortune by any reasonable measure. "This is theirs, was always theirs. Their savings, their possessions, their children's inheritance. It's all here, with 20 years of interest compounded by guilt and justice." Mrs. Hayes stared at the bank draft, her hands trembling slightly as the enormity of it sank in. This is too much. We're just farmers. We don't know how to handle this kind of money." "Then learn," Marcus said gently. "Use it to honor their memory. Build something they would have been proud of. Give your children opportunities they never had. That's what they would have wanted, for their deaths to mean something, for their sacrifice to benefit the generations that came after." The scene repeated itself across 2 territories and 6 months of traveling. Marcus and Mrs. Whitmore, they'd become partners in this strange business of historical restitution, visited farms and ranches and small towns where the descendants of murdered families were living quiet lives of honest struggle. To each family, they brought the same gifts, photographs, stories, and enough money to transform their circumstances without drowning them in wealth they weren't prepared to handle. Some of the descendants wept. Others raged at the injustice that had been done to their ancestors. A few refused the money entirely, saying they wanted no part of blood money, until Marcus explained that refusing it would mean the murderers had won, had successfully kept what they'd stolen. Then they accepted it, not for themselves, but as custodians of their ancestors' legacy. The Kowalski descendants used their inheritance to build a school for immigrant children in Chicago. The Hartley family established a lending program for small businesses in Atlanta. The Davis clan funded a church in Texas that welcomed all denominations and preached forgiveness without forgetting justice. Each distribution felt like a weight lifted from Marcus's shoulders, but also like a new responsibility accepted. He was no longer just spending stolen gold on his daughter's medicine. He was participating in a process of healing that stretched back decades and forward into a future where justice might finally balance the scales. Sarah had grown stronger during his absence. Her letters filled with news of books read and friends made and plans for a future that now seemed not just possible but probable. The nuns who cared for her spoke of her kindness to younger children, her quick mind that devoured knowledge like a person who'd been starving for education, her determination to become a teacher so she could help other children learn to read. When Marcus returned to St. Louis, he found his daughter waiting on the front steps of the convent school, her face radiant with health and hope. She ran to him with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved, who knew she had a future worth running toward. "Papa, did you find what you were looking for?" Marcus hugged her close, breathing in the scent of soap and sunshine and childhood that had almost been lost to poverty and disease. "Yes, sweetheart. I found exactly what I was looking for." That night, as Sarah slept peacefully in her narrow bed at the convent school, Marcus sat by the window, writing letters to lawyers and banks and charitable organizations. The gold was gone, distributed to its rightful heirs, but the work of justice was never really finished. There were other crimes, other victims, other families who deserved to know their stories and claim their inheritance. Mrs. Whitmore had returned to Virginia, where she planned to turn her late husband's estate into a center for historical research and victim advocacy. Her final letter had arrived that morning, written in the same careful hand that had guided them through the desert and through the complex process of making amends for other people's sins. "Dear Marcus," it read, "I wanted you to know that the voices have stopped. For the first time in 20 years, the house is quiet at night. Not the terrible silence of guilt and secrets, but the peaceful quiet of work completed and justice served. Thomas would have been proud of what we accomplished, I think. More importantly, the dead are at rest, and the living have been given what was always theirs." The letter concluded with an invitation to bring Sarah to Virginia for a visit, to see the memorial they were building for the 37 victims, to meet other families who'd been touched by violence and found their way to healing through the patient work of remembering and honoring the dead. Marcus folded the letter carefully, placed it in a wooden box where he kept Sarah's drawings and medical reports and all the other documents that proved love could triumph over circumstance when it was backed up by determination and a little bit of gold. Outside his window, St. Louis was settling into its nighttime rhythm. The sound of riverboats on the Mississippi, the distant music from saloons and dance halls, the ordinary noise of people living their lives without knowing how close they'd come to losing everything that mattered. But Marcus knew. He'd learned the weight of gold and the price of justice, had discovered that some debts could only be paid by the living on behalf of the dead. He'd also learned that redemption was possible, even for men who'd stolen from ghosts, if they were willing to do the hard work of making things right. Tomorrow he would start planning their trip to Virginia, would begin teaching Sarah about the complicated relationship between justice and mercy, would help her understand that wealth was only meaningful when it was shared with people who needed it more than you did. Tonight, for the first time in months, Marcus Kane slept without dreaming of voices or footsteps or faces in the smoke. The dead had found their rest, the living had found their inheritance, and justice, late but not forgotten, had finally been served. In the morning, there would be new work to do, new wrongs to right, new ways to honor the complex relationship between the living and the dead. But tonight, there was peace and silence, and the sound of his daughter breathing steady and strong in the bed beside his. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. But what price did Caleb truly pay for his choice? Did his empire crumble to dust, or did something greater rise from the ruins? And most importantly, did Daniel Cooper survive? Find out in Part 2.